Hello, and welcome to Critters and Cultures, the podcast where we explore the fascinating intersection of animal welfare and cultural diversity. I'm your host and veterinarian, Dr. Azalia Boyd, ready to uncover how cultural differences influence, enhance, and sometimes challenge the way we care for animals and relate to each other. Join us on this journey through global traditions, learning from diverse perspectives, and advocating for empathy and respect in all of our interactions. Thank you so much for joining me on another episode of Critters and Cultures. If something resonates with you during the podcast today, please feel free to send me a direct message, comment below, or join our Critters and Cultures circle. Today, we have an intriguing episode lined up that dives into a topic that's really not often discussed in many fields: religious, secular, and spiritual identity diversity. Our guest, Dr. J.Cody Nielsen, has a wealth of knowledge and experience in this area, having worked as a campus minister and now focusing on promoting equity for all religious and non-religious identities. So we'll be exploring how these identities intersect with animal welfare, the challenges of fostering inclusivity, and what the future holds for pluralism in veterinary and animal care practices. Welcome to the show, Dr. Cody.
It is so good to be with you, Dr. Boyd, and so thankful to be a part of this as you move this podcast forward.
I am so excited to have you. So I'm going to ask you an icebreaker question. You were not ready for this.
Yeah.
This has been a pop question for the guest, okay? I want people to kind of get to know you really quick. So know how your mind works, know who you are. So if you were to create a new holiday that celebrates diversity, what would it be called and how would we celebrate it?
Oh, that's a really, really intriguing question. Well, beyond the fact that I think that Election Day should be a national holiday, I would love to create this sort of cultural pluralism weekend, this sort of all-encompassing festival, if you will, where each, sort of like the block party, but maybe the way in which I'm thinking about this because we're taping this on the day after the Chicago Marathon. So the Chicago Marathon is often known for its sort of cultural expressions. There's like 22 neighborhoods that you go through in 26 miles. And it's often considered one of the very cool marathons because of that. It'd just be fun to make a holiday where the goal was people being able to celebrate their unique traditions and cultures and people going around to like make sure that they learned more about it. So maybe that's not the perfect answer, but I'm thinking about it.
It is perfect. It is absolutely perfect. I don't know what that holiday would be called, but it sounds like a good time. It sounds like a good time for celebrating and for learning. So I appreciate that.
Yes.
It's really, really good to have you on the show, Cody. We met at a conference and I attended one of your talks. I was honestly so intrigued by the topic around religion and diversity, because again, it's something that's not talked about enough when we're discussing increasing diversity efforts. So to start, could you introduce yourself to our listeners and share what motivated you to focus on this identity work?
Thank you for that. So Cody Nielsen, he and him and his pronouns, coming to you from Minneapolis, Minnesota, on the land of the Dakota. And I have a very interesting and sort of weird, circuitous route. So obviously I'm not a veterinarian. I started my career and have spent my entire career in higher education in and around educational systems. And I was working very early on in my career. I had sort of asked questions around religious equity-based concerns in higher education. And nobody was really asking those questions, at least not in the way in which I was sort of looking at it from a systems level. And you alluded there that I became a campus minister, which I did after I went and did 3 years of seminary experience in Washington, D.C., became a Methodist clergy. And that is a complicated and interesting story for me because I am no longer practicing as a clergy. And the reason why is more than we have time for. But what I will say in short is that what shifted my career is that while I was working at the University of Minnesota, a good, strong land-grant institution with a very, very successful veterinary program, there were more than 5,000 Muslim students on campus and more than 2,500 Jewish students on campus. And that's not to name the Sikh, Hindu, Buddhist, as well as the expected Christian communities that were on campus alongside non-religious communities, of course. But those two communities elevated for me a fundamental question. And that fundamental question is, have we as a society ignored, denied, and erased religion as a part of one's lived identity-based concern? And the way in which I saw the erasure of that at the University of Minnesota was in the lack of kosher and halal options as the most visible presence of that. And I was told
Tell me what, say that again. The lack of dietary options. Okay.
So there were no kosher and halal options. So kashrut and keeping kosher is something that some Jewish communities, some members of the Jewish community keep to, which includes a somewhat complex arrangement that includes not eating of shellfish. It means keeping meat and dairy separate. There are a number of different rules and regulations to it. Now, these go back, not every Jewish identifying individual would practice in the same way. So there's no monolithic structure to it. But for those that keep kosher, it's an imperative part of one's lived experience on campus.
Yeah.
At the same time, halal, which is the dietary means on which, and I would argue, more Muslims per capita, percentage wise of the community are likely to keep to, those options require a level of support around meat products as well as similar dietary options as that of kashrut and kosher. But on college campuses, those are often missing. They were missing at the University of Minnesota at the time, back in the early 2010s, and they are missing on our campuses across the country, and they are missing in our society. If you think about on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, if you are working in any industry and you host a lunch party for people, you might ask people to fill out a, sort of like, do you have any dietary restrictions kind of thing. You might go to a caterer. You might plan out where the local establishments have good vegan or good vegetarian or good use of tofu. You might think about those things. What we don't talk about, what rarely gets brought up, is that dietary restriction have anything to do with one's religious and cultural practice.
Let me ask you this. Did you find students complaining or expressing concerns about the lack of those options? Or is it something that you kind of noticed yourself?
So it was a duality of a thing. I think I was a little bit more primed for it because of the work that I got myself into and my wantedness to be involved. So I do think that you have to have the willingness to see it. But what I will say is that I had students coming to me as I built trust with them who expressed those things.
Right.
Now, when I went to senior administration and in higher education, that's usually a dean of students or a vice president of student affairs as it pertains to student-focused concerns from a centralized campus structure. The vice president of student affairs, and I will say, he didn't say this all wrong. It wasn't all his fault, but he also admitted, he said, we're a public land-grant institution with separation of church and state. And I said, none of that matters about meeting the dietary standards. And what led to is a number of conversations with him and others that we were simply either told to avoid the subject of religion whatsoever in the public setting, or people were so deeply unprepared that they had no idea what they were doing. And this is what launched me to go down this road toward what eventually became an international study of the subject. And I will tell you, going back to this sort of question of like, why did you get involved and do this? There's not a lot of folks that do this work. There's a growing population. And I believe that there is a slowly but surely growing awareness. But what I have seen and what I continue to sort of beat, carry the flag or beat beat the hammer to is that it's not about interfaith dialogue. It's not about how do we get to know Jews, Muslims, and Christians together.
Okay.
Those things have been happening since 9/11 and before. The idea of interfaith work has been around for most of the 20th century, but I think had a more public uptick after 9/11, obviously in response to the enormous rises of Islamophobia. So most of the listeners here have at some point been like, oh yeah, I did some interfaith thing, or I've been to something about pluralism. Maybe if you are at all religious, you might have experienced something like this. But what I have said and what I will continue to say is it's not about the dialogue. It's about the systemic inequality.
Which is
the
what we
United
see.
States, right, which is the problem because the United States, our Western society, is built on a framework of mostly white Christian privilege and hegemony. We don't recognize. We are taping this, ironically enough, on Indigenous Peoples Day.
Right.
We know that it is a Monday. We know that it is Monday, October 14th. Why? Because we are on the Gregorian calendar. But our Jewish colleagues have just celebrated the New Year and have just finished arguably the most important religious observance of the year this past Friday through Saturday of Yom Kippur. And we barely even recognize its existence.
Right.
Because the calendar that we operate from tells us that the holiday season is coming right up.
Right.
But for the Jewish community, the holiday season is right now.
Right. With religion seen, like you said, it's a taboo topic, right? Especially in professional settings. How do you navigate challenges when promoting inclusivity around these identities?
Yeah. And so this is where I think when we really start having deep conversations, we realize how complicated it gets.
Right.
So religion is the ultimate,
Yeah, one of the things you
Go
can
ahead.
think, right? And some of the listeners might be thinking, well, what should we do? Should we be off for Jewish holidays? Should we be off for Indigenous holidays? Should we be off for Christmas? Should we be off for Kwanzaa? How do we promote the inclusivity? How do we do it?
I think in some ways the answer to your question right there is yes. I will say that your audience may be highly higher ed, veterinary profession, and I will say that a number of folks in higher education have said to me, they said, well, we can't possibly be off for all of these days. And my response is, how did the New York City public school system figure it out? The largest school system in America figured it out. Now, it continues to take time and energy. And I will tell you, here in Minneapolis, yes, the Jewish holidays are off. Eid, one of the important holidays of Eid at the end of Ramadan, and then a second Eid that celebrates other items. Those are all days that are off in the school year.
So I was going to go off of what you said, the world that we're living in, and just throwing out a stat because you said that the listeners, mostly veterinarians, animal welfare professionals, 90% of veterinarians in the US are white. Right? It still remains one of the least diverse professions. How do you think that lack of diversity within the field affects the ability for veterinarians to understand and connect with clients from various cultural or religious backgrounds?
It's really interesting because I think that question goes both ways. How does the lack of diversity affect, and how does the lack of cultural awareness within the vet med profession affect and keep people out?
Yeah.
There's a thing that we talk about in learning environment theory called constructed environments. It's the idea of who fits where. And we've had this conversation from the beginning of time in STEM fields. Women belong in nursing, but not men. Men belong in engineering, but not women. We have talked about this for generations. And only in the last 20, 30, 40 years have we seen those breakthroughs. And those traumas and the psychological trauma that had to be done for women to push their way through. And I would say in some professions for men to push their way through. And now, we're not just trying to create a gender binary, but just thinking about this, that constructed environment is there. So in the vet med profession, the effect of having it be almost 90% white is affecting the obvious sense of security that folks of color and folks, folks that are not sort of that American white and don't look like that current population, how they would actually feel like they could actually make it through those programs and become a veterinarian.
Right.
At the same time, our veterinary programs are not always conducive.
100%. How would you urge leaders to ensure that they are? If you can tell us more about your work, maybe about workshops that you offer, or, ideas around how can these leaders and institutions ensure that their policies and their practices are inclusive to all identities?
Yeah. So whether you are inside the vet med, like academic field, or whether you are a practitioner yourself, I think the first thing to do is to step back and say, have I ever done any work on this subject matter, personally and systemically and structurally in my work? And if the answer is yes, then the question is, what have I done? Oh, I know a little bit about this or this or this. Okay, got it. Have you explored your own power position, positionality in the midst of this? Those are other deeper questions that one needs to ask. If you are an institution or if you are an institutional leader, I think the bigger question to ask is, what has held us back from having this conversation? And I offer a number of professional development opportunities that help employees, faculty, students start to capture the larger picture. And when I say the larger picture, we have talked about religion as an isolated set of identities for a very long period of time. We're like, okay, I need to understand the difference between Christian, Jew, Sikh, Hindu, Buddhist, non-theistic. But what we really need to understand is the role of religion in conversations around race and gender and sexuality and social economic status and on college campuses, first generation status. And why I think this is so complicated and so hard for folks is because, going back to previously, religion complexifies the conversation around what is inclusion and what is equity, because it organically is a reality that not every person who comes from a religious identity is on board with certain other structures of inclusion that we talk about. So when we start talking about LGBTQIA plus inclusion and we say, okay, this is our firewall, this is all we got. Okay, you have a legal obligation by the First and the 14th Amendment, and every public institution in the country, you have a legal obligation to uphold the religious rights and freedoms of people who have devoutly held religious beliefs. Are you going to tell me that when you encounter such and such individual who does not hold a viewpoint, or a group that wants to gather that does not have a viewpoint that is LGBTQIA plus inclusive, you're going to tell them, no, we can't have that on our campus? Okay, so here's what you've done. You have decided for someone else what is and isn't the wall. And I think this is where we have to start putting religion on the frame of an intersectional frame.
Yeah.
Because it helps us understand why it is so complicated and hard. It's easy when we just say, okay, fine, Jews, Christians, Muslims, blah, blah, blah. We'll do a little bit of accommodation. Please, we'll make it a crest. Maybe there's a prayer room. Maybe there's a day or two you can take off, and, we won't schedule days like this. But it is so much bigger than this.
Yeah. And I get, when you say, we first have to start asking ourselves, do we have any knowledge of this, right? Have we experienced this? And if not, why haven't we? Why isn't this something that we've talked about, right? I do think that you can't be blind to certain things. It's not an excuse to not do the appropriate things.
Yes.
But even the well-meaning organizations unintentionally exclude certain groups because they don't fully consider the diverse identities within their schools, the teams, their communities, right? So it's about being proactive. It's about having these conversations. It's about being thoughtful and truly making sure the best that you can, that everyone feels like they truly belong. You spoke about white Christian supremacy, which can be a very sensitive but important issue to address, especially in leadership and organizational culture. Do you think we need to dismantle these power structures in order to foster more inclusive environments? I don't want to say that, ask the wrong question here, but, explain this white Christian supremacy and how do we overcome that to be more inclusive?
Yeah. Thank you for asking that question. So, to your point, Earlier, I know that I mentioned white Christian hegemony and privilege, and then supremacy at the end here. White Christian privilege or white Christian hegemony is the thing that we were talking about before. When's the holiday season? It's coming right up at the end of November and into December. That's what we call the holiday season. That's white Christian hegemony. White Christian privilege is the reality that we don't have to go to work on Christmas. It's that we don't have to justify and legitimize that for some of us, Good Friday is a day off, or, the stock market in America is closed on Good Friday. Like, we don't have to justify it. That's white Christian privilege. White Christian supremacy, the thing that we are seeing in the current political climate, but that is actually just more been vocalized out loud, so not so much as people are like, the rise of white Christian nationalism and white Christian supremacy. There isn't a rise of white Christian nationalism and supremacy. There is a legitimization. It is the same legitimization. It is where the political factions that have claimed this as part of their platform are making it easier to be racist, sexist, misogynistic, Christian nationalist. So when people say there's a rise in white Christian, there's not. There has not been. There are people in this country who believe that this country should be fundamentally a Christian country and that everyone else should go home or assimilate. And if we understood our history, and if we took our history in the United States, especially back beyond 1693, back to 1493, when the Doctrine of Discovery was signed, and Christendom, through the Doctrine of Discovery, became legitimized, that the legitimization of colonization of the savages is possible, we would have a much more understanding that white Christian supremacy has been in the fiber and the being of America since the colonial and pre-colonial days.
Yeah.
So to your point, do we have to do that? Do we have to root this out first? Yes. We must fundamentally address within our society and within our field the creeping forms of Christian normativity and hegemony, which allows for supremacy culture to remain.
Yeah, I appreciate that answer. And we talked about pluralism. Can you define that for those who don't know what that is?
So it's interesting because the word pluralism gets thrown around an awful lot. In religious spaces, pluralism has been a sort of like interfaith or multi-faith experience. But within that as well, it is led toward a set of practices of sort of commonality. For me, pluralism and a sort of grounded theory that I'm working on to replace, dare I say, the interfaith movement of what I call engaged critical pluralism is not about syncretism, but it's about struggle. It's about the complicated but important realities that our society has to break free of the expectation that we are fundamentally in agreement with each other. And rather, we need to learn how to have hard conversations where the end result is not that we focus only on the lowest common denominator. Like, let's find the handhold where we can agree. We might not. There's a reason why there are major religions in the world that are diametrically opposed to each other, because they don't fundamentally agree. And people say, well, at least we all, like, I've heard people be like, at least we all believe in the same God. We do not.
Right.
But we also don't believe in the same rights. And I will tell you, there's a great story from earlier this election cycle. In 2022, at the end of the last Senate cycle, before the United States House of Representatives flipped, the U.S. House moved to pass an LGBTQ inclusion bill to protect especially trans and non-binary identities, but also sort of moving toward codification after Obergefell, trying to support the LGBT community. And the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the church that some of us call the LDS Church, or what is not as well spoken when we say the Mormons, came out in support of it. And people were like, what in the world is this? And I said, you need to understand this community, because in their statement, they literally said, as a church, we don't agree with the practice of LGBTQIA plus identities. We don't believe it. But we also do not believe that our church body has the right to push our agenda on the whole of society. And they came out in support of the bill. They said, we think that people should have the right to have what they have. We don't practice this and we don't observe this. And to be honest, and I'm almost a little weepy, more faith communities need to figure this out. You can't force your agenda. And that is what pluralism is. Pluralism is saying, I stand on my pillars, my practices, my beliefs, and my oaths. And I will not negotiate, but I also will not force you to uphold to those principles. We're going to struggle to it together. And that's, I think, the deepest form of pluralism that we can see. And it is not this find the common center. It is the find the real truth about people's lived experiences and then just live in the messiness of it.
Right. That's absolutely beautiful. And I love that. I think it's so important. And I would get a little weepy too, because it really goes in celebrating all of our differences. You know, we're talking specifically religious, but like you said, it ties in with cultural differences. It ties in with the way we identify ourselves. And really, that's where the world is so beautiful, when we can all kind of live and be exactly who we are and practice what we believe. So I definitely appreciate that. We talked a little bit before, and I'm going to tie this back into veterinary medicine. I think you had a story where there was a student whose religion wasn't considered during a surgical rotation. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm going to tell you a little bit about that in a way in which I am not a veterinarian, so I'll stumble over the
That's fine.
technicality of the words. So a few years ago, I had a chance to speak at the American Association of Veterinary Medical conference gathering in Washington, D.C. I got a lovely invitation to speak at that conference, and I did a sort of bounded session on religious, secular, and spiritual equity. And afterward, I had a lot of people come up to me. And one of them was a dean who came up to me and she said, "Cody, I have to tell you this story." And I repeat this story now.
Yeah.
She said, "We had a student who was an Orthodox Jew. And in the Orthodox Jewish community, it is forbidden to essentially end any ability for a living creature to not be able to procreate. Thus, when you start thinking about neutering dogs or, like so many of the animals that we care for, he couldn't literally complete the surgical procedure because to essentially complete the neutering would be to be violation of his own religious practice and oath."
Yeah. Yeah.
And she said, it was so fundamentally simple when we figured it out. And I said, "What did you do?" And she said, "We just had them work in pairs. And this student completed the first half, if you will, of the procedure, and the other student completed the other half. So in doing it, the student completed the surgical rotation that was necessary for him to achieve the goal and to be proven capable and competent and able to move forward. And the other student finished the job, if you will."
Yeah.
And that student was able to complete that rotation and move forward with their veterinary medical practice. If that had not been true, that student would have never made it. And where that student is today will be a very interesting thing. Maybe that veterinarian out there very seriously just says, "I can't spade and neuter your animals." And people would say, "Wow, that's a rare one." But maybe they're a specialist in a number of different areas. I know that there are lots of specializations, but he's a vet today because the school said this isn't a problem. This is a challenge and opportunity.
Yeah. The amazing thing about that is that now this student now goes into his or her community, right? And can support that community. There's a lot of biases and a lot of perceived and sometimes actual lack of education around that specific topic about neutering your dogs, spaying your dogs and cats, right? But if someone from his family came in with their pet and the vet, ordinarily, with it again being 90% white and of a specific mind frame, found that out, it might be difficult for that veterinarian to actually relate to that family, right? Or think that that family is not listening to the recommendations. So that's amazing that that level of diversity gets put back in the community to support his community and whatever else comes with the decision of not neutering.
Right.
So thank you for sharing that. And before we close, I do want to just say again that you offer professional development at hospital and clinic levels as well as university levels. And I do think that that can make such a big difference. I love the idea of workshops. They do help veterinary professionals, including myself, improve skills and become more aware of the diverse needs of their clients and colleagues. So thank you so much. As we wrap up, what message would you like to leave with our listeners regarding regarding the importance of religious and spiritual diversity in animal welfare, in veterinary fields, and in all fields.
I think the lasting impression that I would like to say is that if you've been waiting to have this conversation, the time is now, and the time will be forevermore. Current political climates in the world that have maybe drawn our attention to this might be activating a reactionary experience now. This is the beginning of a much larger set of conversations. The need for us to talk about this in its purest form, religious, secular, and spiritual diversity, inclusion, and equity from an individualized and a systemic level. There. The ability to talk about the intersections around religion, gender, race, sexuality, at least. And finally, the talking about how impacts of what we call religious ethno-nationalism in the United States, Christian nationalism and Christian supremacy, are a festering part of our field that are intertwined with colonialism and capitalism is critical. And the opportunity is to just simply say, okay, let's start at the beginning and see where we are. And I love working with groups and organizations around that kind of topic.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And for those that are interested in learning more about your work or potentially bringing your training and workshops to their organizations, where can they find you?
Yeah. So my email address, so my first name is technically Jacob. My parents did this. So the letter J, then a period. Yep. J, period, Cody, C-O-D-Y, period, Nielsen, Nielsen, at convergencestrategies.org, or you can look me up on the website, again, convergencestrategies.org. So really
Awesome.
happy to talk with all of you.
Yes, and we will have those details in the show notes. Dr. Cody, thank you so much for joining us today. This is a topic that I do think so important, and I'm glad that we got to highlight that topic on today's episode. So thank you, thank you, thank you, and thank you to the listeners and viewers for joining us on Critters and Cultures, where we explore the deep connections between humans, animals, and the world around us. Remember, every person has a story, every creature has a story, and every culture has its wisdom. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and keep discovering the wonders of our shared world. Thank you.